I want to talk basically about technology, and I mean an assumption that we often hear is that technology, or a lot of people have this idea with technology that it is neutral or kind of objective, and particularly also with data. And I kind of want to challenge that in the coming 15 minutes. I mean, more and more we want our computers to do our work, and we believe them. Not only in the corporate world, where we see big players, Antoine already kind of talked about big players and small players that are just sucking up a lot of data to create profiles. These are Axiom, for instance, an example of one of those. And the biggest players, also Oracle is nowadays a big player that creates a profile, that create profiles by us. And the assumption, of course, about those profiles is that it kind of explains something about our behavior, not only at the moment, but it may also predict our behavior. And for the people that live in the Netherlands, some of them have maybe already heard of this article, which is about basically the big credit rating agencies in the Netherlands that most people actually had never heard of before, who are creating these massive profiles of basically all the Dutch people about their credit worthiness. And these people, these organizations nowadays also collected data through debt collecting agencies. So debt collecting agencies are not only in the business of actually trying to get people to pay their debts, but nowadays the information that they actually collect in conjunction with that service is suddenly used to create profiles about our credit worthiness. Let's say that on the corporate side, but also the government is now like increasingly relying on data and on big data analysis. And you know, there's a lot of this positive noise around it. And again, I'm not saying that data can be used for good purposes, but we should always be very critical about what we can actually do with it and what the positive, negative consequences are. For example, in the US, courts are nowadays using, some courts are nowadays using proprietary software that helps judges to assess whether what the penalty may be for a convicted criminal. And there was actually a case in Wisconsin where Mr. Loomis was sentenced to prison for 6 years, and a large amount, or that length of that imprisonment, was largely based on the analysis provided, or basically the results provided by proprietary software that basically told the judge that this person had a higher risk of possibly committing crimes in the future. He challenged that. He said, like, well, that infringes my due process because I want to know how that, the result was, how that result was developed, like what data was used for that. But again, since it was proprietary software, he wasn't allowed, or his attorney wasn't allowed to actually get more information about the whole underlying process, how that result came about. So here you see the use of big data for, very life-changing events by the government that can have potentially very severe consequences. I'll dive into that a little bit deeper later on. And another example of this over-reliance on, say, data or big software systems is, again, it was another example in the US where the software that was used to kind of help judges to write legal documents had certain issue, or there were certain errors in the software that basically resulted in people actually innocent people being arrested by mistake. And it's not like one or two people, but that actually happened a lot in California. But again, despite these examples of data leading to very severe consequences, we see this increasing reliance on data, and also this increasing hunger from the government to just collect more. In the Netherlands, we have a new law for the intelligence and security agencies. People probably know that it's kind of controversial and that there will be actually a referendum on this new law. And the core critique on this new law is extending the surveillance powers of the intelligence agencies to bulk surveillance or mass surveillance, which is called like research-oriented interception. I won't delve into this law or in this particular power for the intelligence agencies, but it basically entails like it provides the intelligence agencies the power to just collect large amounts of data from communications data on the cable. So basically, everything you do on the internet goes through cables essentially, and that will now that could possibly now end up in the dragnet from the intelligence agencies. They will collect it. They will apply like what they call negative and positive filtering. Negative filtering is that they just filter out, for instance, YouTube videos, like the data that they just don't want. Positive filtering is the technique where they basically look for certain keywords, for example, or telephone numbers. And then again, they will have a large amount of data that they will analyze to see whether that is relevant for the research they are doing. But what we and the reason why they introduced this law, I mean, it's twofold. First, they see that other countries around the Netherlands provided those powers to the intelligence agencies, so they want to be on the same level in order to also like share intelligence with each other. And the second is that they say, well, we'll be able to find the unknown threats that we just, you know, if we know who what the threat is, we may like intercept the communications, like do it on a targeted basis, which they are already able to do right now. But if we don't know who the actual threat is, we have to rely on collecting more and more data and apply and analyze that data. But there are two problems with this, and I will go into the first one. And this applies not only to, say, big data analysis in the context of mass surveillance by the intelligence agencies, but also applies to the other examples I provided, like in the corporate sector, where you see that it is used for determining whether you can get a loan or not, which is based on a profile that is created by you. And that is the issue of false positives. I included the definition of Wikipedia, so you can read it, and it basically means that, for example, that someone is falsely identified as a terrorist, or falsely or the profile basically falsely determines that that person is not credit worthy. Yeah, so I will keep it to that. And to give an example, or a hypothetical to show the issue of false positives, is imagine that the German intelligence agencies decide to intercept a big city, Berlin, or at least a group of people living in Berlin, say around the communications of 2 million people, because they suspect that there is a group of targets, of possible terrorists, of 10 people. And they have this new technology that they can use to analyze the data, which has an accuracy of 99%. And it sounds, very nice. Oh, wow, 99%. That's very accurate. But it also means that there are false positives, so that people are falsely identified as a target, of 1%, and that false negatives, what it's called, those are the people that basically say the actual targets that are not identified by the system. So if you look at the total population, like the total population of the communications that they intercepted, so 2 million people, that would mean that they would identify, that system would identify 20,010 targets, because basically from the total population of 2 million people, 1% would be falsely identified. That's 20,000 people. And also within that group, they would they would basically, since it is not just a false negative of 1% of the 10 people that are the actual targets in Berlin, that would basically be, so they basically would identify all the targets if it's just a group of 10 people. But if that group would be much bigger, say 10,000 people, then again, they would also misidentify quite a substantial amount of the possible targets. So if you look at it, like it sounds very promising, like, wow, this system has an accuracy of 99%. But then people forget that the false positives, the total amount of false positives in this hypothetical are like 20,000 people are then misidentified as possible terrorists. And then again, then the question is like, so how useful is this whole system? Because if you have such a big group of misidentified people, you would still have to go through all these 20,000, basically 20,000 people to find the actual targets. And this issue of false positives, again, this is just a hypothetical in the, say, the surveillance context by the intelligence agencies, but it applies in any field. And the issue is because we are looking for extremely rare things, particularly in the fight against terrorism, with imperfect technology and systemic bias, and we're doing it more and more, and we just rely on those systems because we think it is objective and efficient. Another example of an article that is in the US that nowadays the FBI basically has 50%, almost 50% of US citizens have been, or 50% of the US citizens are now basically stored, or their face is stored in a database for facial recognition purposes, which is used by the FBI to, for instance, identify potential suspects. But again, when they were analyzing, assessing this system, they found that 15% are, that are 50% of the times there's a, that system actually makes a mistake. So I was just talking about this hypothetical where there is only just like 1% of, you have only a 1% of a false positive or false negative. And this is in the actual, this is in the actual reality. Here we have a system where the FBI collects like millions of people's faces in a database where this false positive rate is 15%. So you can imagine on a population of, say, I don't know the exact population, let's say 300 million people, this is a huge amount of people that are then falsely identified or misidentified, for instance, as a possible suspect. And again, what you see in that study is that it not only creates, also makes a lot of mistakes, but often the people that are affected by those mistakes tend to be from minority groups. For example, in this study, they found that African Americans were disproportionately misidentified by the system. So and that's kind of sad because often these systems are introduced with the argument like, well, people have biases, so we need computers and objective data to decide for us because then we can at least address those biases. But what people always forget is that those biases are also incorporated in the data and systems that are created. A famous saying by Jaron Lanier, a virtual reality expert, is that the fundamental issue actually is that information is just I would say, it's a representation of reality, or data is a representation of reality. Yeah, it's an interpretation of reality. We often think that data is just some objective, physical, like a law or thing from nature. But data are generally created by people in the end. You know, the people have designed the system to generate the data. And it can incorporate moral and political choices. To just give a very simple example, in the Netherlands, for instance, Dutch schools are now required to register the behavioral incidents in school classes. And one of the attributes that they can choose from to determine whether there is a behavioral incident is whether a child wears a baseball hat in the class. But then the question is, who determined that wearing a baseball hat in class is actually a behavioral incident? Like that choice to add that in the system as a attribute for a behavioral incident is basically kind of like a moral or political choice. But we just think that, oh, that is, you know, that's a system. It's just a system we use. It has this air of objectivity. But if you really think about it, it's actually certain political or moral choices are already based at the beginning of that system. So what can we do about this? Just 4 basic things is strength and redress, like the ability for people to challenge decisions made on these, for example, on profiling. If you are unable to get a new mortgage based on a risk profile that has been made by you, you should at least be able to, well, to know that that decision was based on that profile, and also have a very easy way to basically challenge that and get information on the logic of that decision. Because nowadays what we often see is that you will hear like, oh, I'm sorry, you won't get the product or you won't get the service. And only after you like keep on calling, you'll maybe get to hear that it is based on a credit report or a service that they've used by an external party. And then they often just point towards that external party. It's like, well, we didn't make that report, you have to go to that party. And then that party, of course, says, well, we only provided a credit report, and your energy company, they made the decision not to provide you that service. And then you have to go back again. So you get in a kind of a Kafkaesque situation, which is really problematic. Again, address biases, what I said, those systems and the data that is are trained and are made by people. And all people will have certain biases, and the systems made by people will also have those biases. So it's very important that these systems are trained with and tested with data sets that check whether those systems actually make those biases. A more general point, of course, is the transparency. I briefly talked about it. You should at least know, and they should be very clear when these systems are used to make, for instance, those decisions, important life decisions about you. And again, monitoring, also very important. That's part of our job as a small human rights organization, but what Antoine also said, it's also an important job of the government to keep a check on this. So these are, I would say, like 4 practical ways to address these issues. And I don't know what time I just wanted to very briefly show you that this whole positive image of using big data to indeed, for instance, tackle human biases or make very efficient decisions is in some ways it's great. We can use it for good purposes, but we should be really careful to just over rely on those systems. So, thank you.